accept the amendment. We think it's a good one, and we congratulate our distinguished senator from Alaska for offering it.
I thank the chair. Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that the amendment be agreed to by voice vote.
Fine. If there's no further discussion, I would move the amendment.
The question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. I seem to have it. The amendment is agreed to and accepted.
I move to reconsider.
Move to table.
Without objection.
Lay on the table. Mr. President.
Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I have an amendment that I would send to the desk that's been agreed to and asked for unanimous consent that it may be read.
Clerk will report the amendment.
The senator from Alaska, Mr. Murkowski, proposes amendment number 336. On page 43,
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent for the reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, this amendment simply requires the Department of Environment to provide a guide to any citizen who requests one, and the applicable application would be to those businesses who employ 500 or less. It would be no cost to the Environmental Protection Agency, and I believe it's been agreed upon, and I would ask
Mr. President, clarification. I believe that did you send to the desk the revised copy?
I did.
Of all with all the changed language on it?
Senator from Ohio.
Okay.
That is a revised copy, and it's got a notation at the side. Perhaps the clerk could note that regarding the Small Business Administration's.
Okay, fine. No, we were happy to accept that that amendment as modified, and if there's no further discussion, we'd be prepared to accept it. Yes.
There's no further debate.
Mr. President, just suggest the absence of a quorum for a moment while Senator Roth says.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
So ordered.
Mr. President, my understanding, Senator Roth has no objection to this, and I would be prepared to move the amendment.
I would ask unanimous consent the amendment be agreed to by a voice vote, and would ask that my entire statement be entered in the record as if read.
Without objection.
I move for
adoption. The question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes seem to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Thank my
move to reconsider.
Lay on the table.
Without objection. On the table.
Mr. President.
The senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I send an amendment to the desk on behalf of myself, Senator Simpson, Nichols, Kempthorne, Coates, Graham, and Stevens, and ask for its immediate consideration.
Clerk will report the amendment.
The senator from Utah, Mr. Hatch, for himself and others, proposes an amendment number 337. At the end of Title I, add the following new section. Regulatory.
I ask unanimous consent that further reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Without objection. So ordered.
Mr. President, I consider this to be a very, very important amendment. I think every city, town, and hamlet in this country would be grateful if this amendment passes. And I would just cite with particularity this particular chart just to begin with, and then I'll refer back to it later. This chart shows the percentage distribution of regulatory costs between 1977 and 1988 and how they have changed. In 1977, environmental regulatory costs were 9% of the total regulatory costs of our country. Today, they are 23% and going up rapidly. You can't ignore that. Environmental costs are eating our cities, towns, municipalities, communities alive. And that's because there's no restraint, and there's nothing in the law that really provides for any restraint. And we have people back here who are in many ways unrealistic in what they're imposing upon cities, towns, and municipalities through the regulatory process that are costing all of those entities arms and legs that they really can't afford. And so my amendment is a very simple one, but nevertheless a very important one. And so I offer this amendment to S-171. And let me first say that I'm very supportive of efforts to protect our environment today and in the future. And I will add my voice to the many voices now being heard that say that we must have clean water, we must have clean air, and we must protect the environment from the damaging consequences of needless pollution. Now, these are goals that I'm positive everybody in this body desires to achieve, and to achieve in our lifetime. I would even put in a plug here for a program the state of Utah has employed for the past several years. This program is called Don't Waste Utah. It sets forth specific plans and objectives towards encouraging recycling, eliminating littering on Utah's lands, and educating Utah's youth as to the benefits of becoming environmentally conscious. We should all adopt this slogan and apply it nationwide. Don't waste America. But at the same time, I am very conscious of the effects pursuit of these goals may have on our economic future. The number of regulations put forward by most, if not all, federal agencies has continued to have a stifling impact on Utah's economy specifically and on our nation as a whole. Studies have concluded that regulatory costs of the American people are on the rise. A recent updated study by Professor Thomas Hopkins at the Rochester Institute of Technology has estimated that the overall costs of federal regulatory activity in 1992 have reached $564 billion. That's better than $500 billion just in regulatory costs. Now that breaks down to approximately $5,000 per American household. We all are paying about $5,000 per household in order to meet this $564 billion, better than $500 billion regulatory burden. Some would say over-regulatory burden. Paul W. McAvoy with the Yale School of Management estimates that between 1971 and 1987, regulation lowered gross domestic product annually by 1.5 to 2%. Think about that. Lowered gross domestic product annually by 1.5 to 2%. Now that's Paul McAvoy, well known here in Washington and all over the country. Economists Dale Jorgensen and Peter Wilcoxon, in an article published in the Rand Journal of Economics, concluded that environmental regulation alone accounted for an approximately 2.6% drop in GDP between 1973 and 1985. And as you can easily see from this chart, from 9% of total regulations to now 23%, and this pie should be much larger, of course, if we had done this accurately, because regulations have grown by leaps and bounds to $564 billion a year, the cost of them. Now, Professor Hopkins estimates that environmental compliance costs in 1992, just environmental costs, the compliance costs in 1992, cost the American economy $122 billion. These costs will rise in 1992, according to the July 1992, and this is 1988, so it's even bigger now. These costs will rise in 1992, according to the July 1992 mid-session review of the 1993 fiscal year budget. The EPA expected to issue 25 major regulations costing an estimated $14 billion additional dollars. Now, Mr. President, these costs are not budgeted by the federal government. They appear on no official ledgers. However, regulatory costs are paid by businesses, state and local governments, and the American people in the form of higher-priced goods, fewer jobs, smaller benefits, decreased productivity, and lost innovation. I propose that the very best economic stimulus package this body could pass is one that eliminates many of the burdensome regulations now in existence that prevent businesses from expanding, that require local governments to redirect scarce resources away from education and other services, and that result in lost employment in both urban and rural areas. This is not a new issue. but a new time to consider the subject and to take effective, hard approaches to addressing it. I might add, when President Clinton says we need an economic stimulus package because unemployment hasn't come down the way we want to, even though it has come down from 7.8% to 7%, what he's failing to understand is we here in Washington, through mandates passed by Congress and over-regulatory conduct on the part of these agencies, we have made it almost impossible for businesses to expand, especially small businesses. And many of them don't want to expand beyond a threshold of, say, 15 employees that trigger all kinds of legislative mandates, let alone all of these over-regulatory burdens that are placed upon them. Who is accountable for these costs? The regulators? The President? The Congress? Well, as we attempt to achieve our goals to protect the environment, we often do a disservice to those we intend to protect. The regulations imposed in response to legislation passed by Congress can be extremely costly to the public and private sectors. Nearly half of all compliance costs for municipalities have primarily resulted from water pollution programs mandated by the Clean Water and Safe Drinking Water Acts, according to the EPA. The agency also estimates that another third of compliance costs results from the mandates of the Clean Air Act. The remaining costs are attributable to a variety of land pollution programs mandated by the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, CERCLA, and the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA, I guess is what it's called. Also included in this category are the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, EPCRA, enacted with the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act of 1986, SARA, and the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, OSHA. And that's just to mention a few of the major complicated agencies. This breakdown by EPA does not reflect compliance costs that cities and counties incur preparing environmental impact statements required by the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. The increasing restrictions on land and natural resource uses, which affect state and local revenues, or the enormous costs of litigation made possible by the Act. These environmental laws and the regulations that accompany them are not necessarily unreasonable. What is unreasonable is that these laws and their corresponding regulations lack sensitivity to all of our states, but particularly to the western states, and do not take into consideration rural areas where most of our public lands are located and where most of these regulations have their most direct effect. I hope that by